if people are just coming off of mute and asking questions. So that's why please put it in the chat box. At the end of the session, in the chat box, there will be a link for an online evaluation, and you'll also get a follow-up email, which Angela will remind folks about at the end, just in case you've forgotten, that will have the link for our online evaluation. Please fill it out. It will help us to improve these webinars as we go through. I think that is all from me. So we're going to move on to our first presenter, who is Yafa Jarar. She is a Grievance and Adjudication Officer at the PSAC's Representation and Legal Services branch. She has been working at PSAC for exactly 1 year. Her professional, academic, and community engagement backgrounds are in social justice, the labor movement, and human rights. Yafa graduated from the University of Ottawa's Common Law program in 2017. She was admitted to the Saskatchewan Bar Association in 2018 and to the Ontario Bar Association in 2019. So I just want to give Yafa a warm welcome. She's really been heading up and leading a lot of our fight around 699 leave and making sure that the policy is being implemented fairly. So I'm going to put myself on mute and turn it over to Yafa. Thank you. Sorry, Yafa, we can't hear you. It's very, very, very low. It's showing that you're not on mute. No, nothing now. Oh, there we go.
You can hear me now?
It's still very low. Is there any way you can turn up your volume at all?
Let me just try. My apologies for this. I'm not really sure why this is happening. I'm going to try to put my headphones on.
People are saying they can hear you fine, Yafa.
Oh, okay. Okay, perfect. If it's good now, then I will go on. Please let me know at any point if that changes. Thank you, Nicole, for the introduction, and thank you for having me present here. Good evening, everybody. As Nicole mentioned, my name is Yafa Jarar, and I'm a Grievance and Adjudication Officer at the Representation and Legal Services branch at PSAC. I have been involved in filing and presenting the 699 leave policy grievances on behalf of PSAC, and I am one of the people leading this file moving forward. This evening, I will be presenting on 3 main things. Number 1, how 699 leave works for Treasury Board and other separate agencies' employees, and the recent changes to 699 leave and the eligibility for accessing such leave based on the employer's current policy. Secondly, I will be talking about updates regarding PSAC 699 leave policy grievances and where we're at in terms of the legal process that we're involved in. And finally, what can you do as members and employees if you're facing challenges accessing 699 leave? So in regards to how 699 leave works, I understand that there has been a big challenge, or it has been quite challenging understanding exactly what circumstances make an employee eligible for 699 leave. And I just want to start by saying that part of this confusion is due to the fact that the employers themselves did not really know exactly how 699 works, or they were in the process of trying to figure out their own policies and guidelines. So this created quite a bit of confusion for everybody, for the members first and the employees, and also for the union. A lot of the changes in regards to 699 and mixed messaging, unclear guidelines have almost made it impossible for us to pin down what kind of advice to give members. Right now, the information that I'm giving you today is what we have today in regards to the policies that the employer is, or the employers are implementing for 699. Having said that, they are constantly changing, but we do make sure through our components and through the communications from PSAC that we are sending those updates in regards to the changes of the policies as best as we can. And this is partly why we're here today, is to kind of make it easier to understand what situations apply for 699 leave. But I do want to also say that from the perspective of the PSAC, and based on the directives issued by the employer starting in May of 2020, as well as our understanding and our interpretations of 699 leave that is in place, as well as the collective agreements, we understand 699 leave to be in place to respond to a novel and unique situation that is COVID-19 pandemic, and directly correlates to with the article or in many different collective agreements, that is leave with pay for other reasons. These provisions, again, are provided in various collective agreements that are negotiated by the PSAC. As an example, Article 5301 of the Program and Administrative Services states leave with or without pay for other reasons. And in particular, it says, at the discretion of the employer may grant leave with pay with circumstances not directly attributed to the employee prevent his or her reporting for duty. Such leave shall not be unreasonably withheld. So from our understanding, and again, this article is provided in various collective agreements, perhaps worded a bit differently, but in most of them it is an identical wording. But this is exactly a situation where members and employees are facing challenges that are not attributed to them. They're outside of their control. So they should be able to access 699 leave. I trust that most of you have received the frequently asked questions. And I apologize also if I'm looking a little bit to the side, just looking at my notes in different places. So the purpose of this document that was circulated is just to put, as of January 2021, again, this is based on one of the employer's documents to explain when and how the employer is granting and interpreting how 699 leave based on 699 code can be used. So this document is not our document. This document is just meant to clearly and without much confusion, perhaps inform us as to how the employer is using it. In a nutshell, and I'm not sure, maybe we can share, I will share the document on my screen in just a little bit, if you don't have it in front of you. But in a nutshell, leave, 699 leave will be granted by the employer on a case-by-case basis. And a large amount of discretion is given to individual managers to determine if the employee is eligible for 699 leave. and only after remote or alternative work or flexible work hours have been considered, and generally only after other relevant pay leave has first been used by the employee. So this is in a nutshell. Once all of the available options have been considered and managers have consulted with their own labor relations advisors, other leave with pay, which is 699, could be available. The employer does not say will be available, they say could, or they use the language of may. And that all has to do with giving managers larger discretion to look at individual examples that employees are facing and studying those different situations and scenarios, and then determining whether they will be eligible for 699 or not. So some of the issues that the employer may take into account includes challenges with technology limitations. An employee is unable to work remotely or has been diagnosed with COVID-19. The employee is experiencing symptoms and or is required to self-isolate. The employee has caregiving responsibilities as a result of such things as school or daycare closures, or COVID-19 illness or isolation requirements, or an employee cannot work remotely and is at high risk or has someone in their care who is at high risk of severe illness from COVID-19. So I'm just going to quickly try and share the frequently asked questions document here. See if I can share it on my screen. Apologies, it's a little bit difficult to maneuver. Okay, share screen. So is my screen shared now, Nicole?
Hi, Yafa. Yes, it's Beth. We can see your screen.
Okay, thank you. So I included a little note at the beginning that these guidelines and policies, as I mentioned, they're the employer's policies that they implemented in regard to 699 other leave with pay. The PSAC has filed 2 policy grievances, and we will be filing a human rights complaint as well. And these questions, as I mentioned, are only to clarify how employers are implementing 699 other leave with pay. So the first question is, will I be eligible for code 699 if I'm experiencing symptoms associated with COVID? The quick answer is yes. Again, 699 may be used, and I do want to emphasize may here again, because it still is discretionary on the part of management and the employer. For hours not worked when employees are experiencing COVID-19 symptoms and are waiting for testing or required to self-isolate as instructed by public health or a doctor. So what this really means is that the amount of time that the employer is saying employees can access 699 leave is during those hours or that time where an employee may be waiting for testing. This does not mean that even if the diagnosis is positive for COVID-19, that 699 will immediately be available for use. If an employee is experiencing symptoms of COVID-19, but not well enough to work, if you're well enough to continue working, you can work remotely, as I mentioned before. Alternative arrangement can be discussed with the manager, and the employee will receive regular pay. And here with regular pay, we try to also clarify with the employer, or at least in this situation with Treasury Board in particular, and other agencies are following very similar policies to the Treasury Board, just to make sure that alternative work as the employer also means similar pay or the same pay as your substantive position. And they have said that is the case. If you do receive positive test results and you are diagnosed with COVID-19, so here, this is the part that is troubling, is that, or one of the parts that are troubling, is that the employer, when they implemented the change to the policy as of November 2020, they are requiring employees to first use and exhaust all existing and available leaves, including sick leave, including family leave in some situations, before 699 can be accessed. And there are, of course, many obvious issues and problems with this approach, but this is the employer's policy as it exists today. If you receive positive test or diagnosed with COVID and you don't have any balance in your sick leave, then in some cases, some employers are asking that other types of leave that are available in the collective agreement be used first or explored. If all of those are not available, then 699 might apply. If you need to take time off to take care of a family member who is diagnosed with COVID-19. So here, employees who cannot attend work because of caregiving responsibilities are expected to use family-related leaves that is available in the collective agreement, including also vacation or other available banks that are available to them. If you have exhausted all of those other available leaves or vacation or other banks under the collective agreement or the terms and conditions of employment, then access to 699 again may be the case. Do you need to provide proof of having caregiving responsibilities? The short answer is yes. In most cases, if not all cases so far, managers have been asking for documentation and proof that whether it be for, of course, for COVID diagnosis or caregiving responsibilities for a family member. So here again, there also has been some issues with the questionnaires and the type of documentations that employers are asking and requiring from employees. There isn't one consistent list of or type of documentation that the employer is requiring in order to grant 699 leave. So we are paying close attention at what type of questions and documents the employer is asking for that, especially when it has to do with other family members, and especially when it has to do with medical information and confidential information that sometimes is too intrusive or unreasonable. It's important here to note that it is reasonable for the employer, according to according to the law and according to some collective agreements, to ask for certain documentations for sick leave, and in this case for COVID leave. That is okay. What is not okay, and this is where it becomes a little bit tricky and needs to be also by the union visited on a case-by-case basis, is when the employer goes above and beyond what might be reasonable in terms of acquiring information. So here, and I will come back to this point again towards the end, it's very important that if you're not sure, and if you do receive either questionnaire or request for documents from your employer and you're not sure if that's the right type of document to be asking for, to consult with your union rep or with your component, and to make sure that that is the case. And then hopefully they will be able to help you as to how to move forward. But it's also important for us as we prepare for adjudication to kind of also know this type of information and what kind of questions and documents the employer is asking for. Will you be eligible for payment under 699 if your child is required to self-isolate or is diagnosed with COVID-19? So here, this goes to the heart of our first grievance that we filed back in May 13th of 2020. The employer will first ask for alternative childcare arrangements before they can do that. They will ask, either for documentation or ask questions whether there's other alternative childcare arrangements that are available. And that includes school closures and daycare closures, not just if your child is ill or is required to self-isolate. Again, similar to the medical questionnaires, the type of questions and information that the employer will ask for is not consistent across the board. So if you're not sure, again, check with your union rep, check with your local. In this case also, even if there isn't alternatives to childcare, the employer will ask for you to access other paid leave available under the collective agreement. And in this case, employers have asked for members to use vacation leave, to use family leave, to use anything else available really in terms of leaves. Exhaust those first, and then maybe 699 will be considered. So I'm gonna just stop my my screen sharing here, trying to find out how.
Yafa, if you click at the bottom, like I can do it for you if you want, but you can just click
please.
stop. Okay, I'll do it.
I don't normally use Zoom for work, so it's a little bit.
Oh, okay, Beth, I might need you to jump in because I clicked stop sharing, but it seems to not be unsharing Yafa's screen.
Hi, I'm not sure that you can unshare Yafa's screen. Yafa, do you see the stop share at the bottom?
It is not appearing for me. Oh, actually, sorry. I'm not really sure why. My screen is just being too, oh, there we go.
Okay, I think we're good. Okay.
Okay. So it stopped sharing now, I assume. Okay. So just back to our discussion here. This is in a nutshell how the employer is implementing 699 leave. I hope that this is, I know it might not have answered all of your questions in terms of your specific examples, but again, I do ask that if you are in doubt as to whether your specific situation requires 699 leave or there's eligibility there, to contact the union to ask for clarification. In terms of updates regarding PSAC's leave, 699 leave policy grievances, as I mentioned, PSAC filed 2 policy grievances with the Treasury Board, has also filed another policy grievance with based on the recent changes, that is that members will have to exhaust all other leave before they can access 699. We filed another policy grievance with the Treasury Board on that one, as well as CFIA and other agencies as well. So right now, what is happening with those grievances is that we are waiting on the final level presentation with the Treasury Board. And other agencies will be following the outcome of those. If our grievance is denied, then we will be referring it to adjudication. And of course, that would be with the Federal Public Sector Labor Relations and Employment Board. The board has agreed to hear both grievances together. So the first one has to do with the 699 policy in general, and especially when it has to do with having to do with caregiving and childcare. And the second one has to do with the changes where the employer is saying we have to use other leaves in the collective agreement. The board agreed to hear both of them first. So once we finish the final level presentation, and in case it's denied, we refer it to the board, and we ask that it will be heard in an expedited manner. So we don't have dates yet, but definitely there will be communication as to when that's going to happen. And we are doing everything we can. We are working around the clock to make sure that our documents are in order, our examples are in order, and that we're doing everything we can to move this as fast as possible. In terms of what you can do if you're facing challenges accessing 699 leave, and I've touched on this a little bit throughout my explanation of what situations this leave applies to. I would say ask for 699 leave if you're facing challenges completing your work due to COVID-19 reasons, whether it be childcare issues, symptoms, diagnosis, caregiving of a child, or a parent or a family member. Always do ask for that leave from the employer. Try to document the request, preferably by email if possible, and document the response that you receive from the employer. Share that with your union if you can. If it is denied, then you can definitely consult with your union rep and see if it is a situation where you should be filing an individual grievance, and your union is equipped to assist you how to do that and how to go about it. But it's important that you do ask for it if you think that you should be eligible for it, and if you think that you're actually not able to complete your work duties because of COVID-19 related reasons. Even if it does get denied, it's important for us to pursue that and challenge it as well. So we will need the members' help in that. And I think that that concludes my presentation on 699 for this purpose. And maybe I'll refer to Nicole now to help with the questions if there are any.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Yafa. That was very informative. There are plenty of questions coming in, which thankfully Amakai is on the back end and also answering some of them. So we will get to as many as we can. And again, I just want to assure people that if we don't get to your question during our question and answer period, we'll get you something in writing at a later date. So the first question, because I'm just going to start from the top and go down, is if the employer's policies keep you from reporting to work, an example, a mild cold symptom, should you be eligible for 699 leave?
If the employer's policies keeps you from reporting to work, so I'm not sure I understand the question exactly. If the employer's policy says that if you have a mild cold, then you should not report to work, is that, am I understanding that correctly?
So I think they were saying, a lot of employers are saying, like, if you, or public health is saying, if you have mild cold symptoms, don't go to work, stay home. And
Right.
they're
right.
saying, should they be able to access 699 leave if, they have these mild cold symptoms?
Yes. So according to the employer's policy, and again, this is the policy that employers have adopted. That doesn't mean that all managers are following their own policy properly. So according to the employer's policy, yes, but you are only covered until you for the time until you get the testing results for COVID, right? Because 699 is attached to COVID-19. So if there's a mild cold and it's not COVID, the employer will ask you to take sick leave, not 699. If you think it might be 699, then the employer will give you 699 leave for that amount of hours that you are waiting for the test results to come out. So if your test results come out in 2 hours, then you are covered for those 2 hours only. This is based on their own policy.
Thank you.
And then after that, you will have to use first exhaust all other available sick leave before the employer can give you 699.
Thank you. The second question I'm going to pose is, it's been pretty confusing for our members when some are granted 699 leave, and it appears other managers disallow this use. Can you give us any tips on how to explain the difference to our members?
Again, I think there has been confusion across the board. And the confusion has also been because the employer or different managers are not implementing the employer's policies consistently. And that's because some managers are not understanding their own policy. And so I think from our perspective, from our side, we want to make sure that our members and our components and all the and the union, we understand the employer's policy in order to know how to use it, but also how to challenge it when it's not used properly. Besides really the members informing the union that there are issues, it's really difficult for the union to know that the employer and the managers are not using it properly or are not using it consistently. In terms of reaching out to the members, that is outside the scope of my work at PSAC, but I do understand that there are other branches, and this presentation is an example that was organized here. But I also do know that many components are doing a lot of outreach and work in that front. I hope I understood the question properly.
Thanks, Yafa. I was asked to have my doctor complete a form in regards to my qualification of medical 699 leave. I have zero issues with management asking for medical proof of qualification. However, in the document, it stated what the employer has done in the workplace to address COVID and make it safe. Some of the examples given were misleading, exaggerated, and in some cases, flat out lies, all of which could have impacted my doctor's decision and led to a bad and life-risking decision consequence. So my question is, are you aware of this? And if so, what will be done to address this?
So the employer in the request to the doctor included false information about the safety of the workplace?
That's correct.
Right. So, I mean, in this case, I would definitely bring that up to the union. In many cases, doctors, so this is also important in terms of documentation that some employers are asking of doctors. Doctors are not, and most will refuse to comment on whether the nature of the workplace is safe, appropriate, etc., for the condition of their patient. That is not their job. That's beyond the scope of their profession. What they can comment on is, and in their doctor's note, is this patient has these conditions. My recommendation for this patient is to stay home, or This patient it's okay if this patient goes to work but wears a mask, whatever the situation may be. But the doctor cannot comment on the safety of the workplace because they're not a health and safety officer and they don't know, they haven't been to the workplace. So even if it's written in a document, that is beyond the scope of what a doctor's note should be. This is, based on my conversations with our specialists and professionals in the area at PSAC, but also based on similar examples coming from components. So in the end of the day, there are ways to challenge that, but I would, because it's hard for me, this is a general question, I would go to the union and bring it up, and they'll be able to advise you better than that. But in any event, always ask for a doctor's note or document. The doctor will decide, or the employer can say you can include this information, but the doctor, if the information is outside their scope, from our experience, they have refused to comment on it.
So,
Thank you.
Oh, Nicole, can I just jump in here? I just want
Sure.
to reinforce. Hi, it's Angela Fairweather calling. I'm the Regional Health and Safety Representative for Ontario. And I just wanted to reinforce what Yafa said there in terms of going to the union, but specifically going to your union representatives on the Health and Safety Committee, because those kinds of things, the safety precautions and the safety procedures that are put in place at the workplace should have traveled through the Health and Safety Committee. So they should be aware of those things. If the information is inaccurate, then it needs to be taken up at that Health and Safety Committee. And of course, if it's not dealt with there, then there are other avenues it can go to. But it is your representatives on the Health and Safety Committee that you need to be speaking to about those things. Thank you for letting me interrupt and just reinforce that.
Yeah, thank
No
you.
problem. So I'm going to combine two questions. One question is, what is the definition of being high risk? And then the second question is, for those like myself who are considered high risk, but there's no work available as per the supervisor in terms of working from home, do I lose all of my sick leave and accumulated leave? My supervisor has no problem with the 699 leave, but is unsure of when to access leave.
So to the first question, Nicole, I might have to ask you to repeat the second part, but
Sure.
what defines high risk? Again, this is the doctor. This is the employee. This is the member and the doctor. High risk can range from asthma to, I don't know, because I'm not a doctor. So if your doctor says your condition, your specific condition, whatever it may be, puts you at high risk because of the nature of COVID-19, that is all they have to do to say that the patient is at high risk and requires to stay at home and to work from home, because otherwise it would be a danger on their health and their life, right? So this is what the doctor will be doing. In terms of the second one, Nicole, if you could please repeat it, because I wasn't sure exactly. I heard contradicting parts of it.
Sure. The member was saying, for those people that are considered high risk, but their supervisor is saying that there's no work that they can do at home. They're wondering if they lose their sick leave or accumulated leave.
Right.
They also coupled that with saying that their supervisor doesn't have a problem with 699 leave, but is just unsure how to access it if they don't have work to provide them at home to do.
That's a good question. So because the employer is supposed to look at alternative work or work remotely, similar classification, similar pay, right? If there isn't any other work that they can do because of the specific nature of the work, which we have examples of that from members, then according to the employer's policy, they should be eligible for 699 leave in that case. What this means is it is not good enough to say, I don't like this type of work from home, and therefore, because it's not, that is not good enough. When that happens, it has to be that the employer is saying there's absolutely no alternative work for this member or for this employee to work from home and do something else, do data entry or whatever it is with the same pay. We don't have any required, or we don't have any work for that. In that case, the employer is required, according to their own policy, to give 699 leave. So the supervisor should be aware of that, of course, but I mean, it's up to the employer, and they should be informing their managers and training them on their own policy. Again, this is their own policy. We are studying their policy. So they should also be informing their own management and supervisors as to how to implement it. In this case, of course, I would ask for 699 leave. If the employer is saying there's no alternative work for you and you're high risk, so you have to work from home, then you should access it.
Thank you. So we'll probably have time for a couple more questions. I know that many questions that people posed, we've not been able to get to yet, but again, I'll just reiterate, we will get you written responses to your questions. So there's a few questions just around 699 leave with regards to caring for children. So if a child must, I'm gonna ask you two in one, okay?
Yeah.
If a child must be self-isolating, why would an employee be required to find alternative daycare for that child? The second piece of that is having an alternative childcare for a COVID positive child would violate health unit regulations and be exposing other people. So I'm not sure if maybe folks misunderstood some stuff in your presentation.
So in this case, what alternative arrangements the employer may ask for, if the child is self-isolating in the house, for example, and the parent has other members living in the house, including a partner or a spouse or a parent or an older sibling, then the employer will ask that whether the partner or the spouse or the roommate or whoever is also in the house self-isolating with the child can look after the child while the employee is working. That's what the employer will interpret alternative childcare as in this particular case.
Thank you for that clarification. For 699, all leave must be used. All leave must be used before 699 leave will be considered. Does that include comp time?
I don't know if comp time is included in the word all other banks, because they do, the employer does use the word banks, but without, so for example, they wouldn't say, I haven't seen overtime. I haven't seen comp, but they might. And the language may have been left without, great specification for that reason, but I do not know. I would ask the employer, ask them in writing and see what they say. Ask them to clarify the policy, if that's what it means. And if that's the case, and let the union know that this is what the employer said about the policy.
Thank you. What would happen if an employee has taken all family and other leave and then needs to take a family day off for reasons unrelated to COVID?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And that goes to, again, to the heart of our second grievance. So the member would not be able to use 699 for a family leave because all of the family leave has been exhausted, right? So the employer is saying you can only do it one way around. use all of the leaves, family leave, vacation, sick, before you can access 699, even though you're not on vacation, even though you're not. So in this circumstance, the employer is asking the employees to, in a way, violate the collective agreement. That's how it can be read, right? And I agree, it doesn't make sense at all. I mean, based on this policy so far and what we have heard from the employer, it's too bad. You know, you wouldn't be able, if you needed to use your family leave for COVID, before you can access 699, and then later on needed to take leave for family reasons, family leave, then family leave is not available anymore. And that is one of the main issues that PSAC has, of course, with this policy. And this is one of the reasons that we are challenging it legally.
Thank you so much, Yafa. We really appreciate the insight and your fight in these grievances. We're very hopeful that we will win these grievances and the employer will be more equitable and fair with their implementation of 699 leave. So at this point, we're going to say thank you, and I'm going to turn it over to Angela, who will introduce our next panelist for this session.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yafa. Some very, very good information there. And as demonstrated by the number of questions that we have, how engaging and informative that was for the membership. So thank you very much. So again, Nicole said, I'm Angela Fairweather. I'm the Regional Health and Safety Representative for Ontario. The second half of this webinar is called Returning to Work, Airborne Risk and Ventilation. And because we've had a lot of questions from you in terms of this kind of thing, so we decided that we would bring in an expert from OCAL, the Occupational Health and Safety Health Clinics for Ontario Workers, and that person is John Odick. So just let me give a short overview of our speaker, and then I will hand it over to John. So John, since 1989, John has been an occupational hygienist with the Hamilton Clinic of the Occupational Health Clinics for Ontario Workers Incorporated. So that's known as OCAL. Prior to working for OCAL, John had health and safety and environmental responsibilities for 3 factories and 3 cast iron foundries with mid-size auto part firm. John graduated from chemical engineering at the University of Waterloo in 1983 and from McMaster University Health Research Methods program in 2005. He has an appointment as an assistant professor part-time to McMaster University in the Department of Health Research Methods, Evidence and Impact, HEI for short. He's certified both with the Canadian Registration Board for Occupational Hygienists and with the American Board of Industrial Hygienists. So having said that, I'm going to hand it over to John for him to load his presentation. And then, as Nicole said, we'll do the presentation first. And then there'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions. I already see one in there. We'll harvest those questions and hopefully we'll get to as many of them as we can. Thank you very much. I'm going to pass it over to John.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation to share this session with you. And I've pre-recorded this, so I'm going to play it. Please let me know if the sound doesn't come through. But I'll be around to answer questions, and so I'll give it a go. I'll stop my video so it won't obstruct the view. Hello, and thank you for participating in this webinar. I'll be talking about airborne transmission of the COVID virus and doing something about ventilating. I want to start by talking about my grandson. I'm an OPA, grandfather, and therefore I got bragging rights. So here's a picture of me trying to teach my grandson how to skate. This was a couple of years ago. But recently, at the end of September, he started JK. And one day he ended up sick because he had a runny nose. So his mom had to come and pick him, and it was about a half-hour drive in the car with him and his sister, a younger sister. And when mom got home, she found that she couldn't handle it, so we offered to help out. So we came over and picked him up. And the next day, mom was sick too, and dad had a scratchy throat, so he stayed home from work. So we picked him up again and brought him home, and he came along with some of his schoolwork. And in his schoolwork was this nice picture of coughing into your sleeve. And while he's showing it to me, he coughs into my face. And so I remind him about the etiquette, and he says, "Oh, that's just for school." I was just amazed that in 3 weeks of school, he could already have that attitude of splitting education from reality. Anyway, I got sick that evening, and then a few days later, my partner got sick, and my son got sick, and a few days later, his girlfriend got sick. My grandson's sister also got a mild case, and the grandson and his dad both got tested for COVID, and it was negative. But whatever it was, the symptoms came on really fast within a day or two, and everyone seemed to get it. Half of his class was off sick, and it eventually went through the other classes in the school, and half the teachers in the school were off. Now, this is not COVID. This is different than COVID. In COVID, most cases don't spread to more than 1 or 2 people. However, there's a minority of cases that spread it to a lot of people, sometimes called super spreader events. The super spreader event is not just a person, but it's the interaction of a person, an environment, and over a time trend of the disease. It's called the power law, or the Pareto distribution, where 10 to 20% of the cases will cause 80 to 90% of the infections. And these are often caused in crowded places, close contact settings, and confined and enclosed spaces. And these are the 3 C's that the WHO is trying to get everybody to be aware of in order to avoid further transmission. Then there's the famous restaurant in Gwangju. If you look at the picture there, you see the African pot restaurant on the 2nd floor. It's kind of hole in the wall type place, very crowded, and there was an outbreak there. And there was an investigation that was published, and they concluded that it was droplet transmission being blown around by an air conditioning fan. However, they noted our study has limitations, and we did not conduct an experimental study simulating the airborne transmission. So what happened next was another group did exactly that. They did the simulation, and they took measurements in the restaurant, and they came to a different conclusion, that short-range aerosol spread, which includes large droplets and small droplets, was the cause. And it emphasized that it's crucial to prevent overcrowding and provide good ventilation in buildings if you want to avoid this type of transmission. Here's a picture of their simulation, and you can see with the blue cloud where the infected person and the other infectees were sitting. Then there was the famous choir in Skagit Valley, where 61 people attended a practice for the choir, and 53 of them became infected. There's also a recent publication from South Korea where in August a number of people in an apartment building became infected, and they had no contact with each other. And what it was found was that the air vents to the washrooms were spreading the virus when the temperature was in an inversion. So instead of the air going up the vent, because of the temperature differential, it went down the vents and spread the virus from one bathroom to the next bathroom. A similar thing happened in Hong Kong in March, and here's a newspaper story that came up with a theory of how it happened. And this was once it got outside, it circulated because of airflows and ended up coming into the kitchens of other apartments. And this all sounds familiar because in SARS-1 back in 2003 in Hong Kong, there was an outbreak in a number of high-rise apartment buildings, and people did modeling of the airflows due to the wind direction, and they found that under certain wind directions, the air would go down and go into other apartments, and explained how people who had no contact with each other ended up infecting each other. And since we're talking about bathrooms, here's a study of the particles that are emitted from a toilet seat when you flush the toilet. And they put a certain ray of light, and you can see the particles. And beside it there shows where most of the particles land on the floor or walls, depending on what the stall looks like. However, we had a hard time getting people to accept that it's airborne. In fact, this is a tweet that was sent out by the WHO in March 28, 2020, that basically said that messages on social media saying that COVID was airborne were fake news, and it was incorrect. And they said COVID-19 is not airborne. However, in October of this year, they changed their tune, and they did say that under certain conditions, whether in enclosed spaces, prolonged exposure to respiratory particles, and inadequate ventilation, actually the 3 C's stated in other words, you can get airborne transmission, and that to prevent airborne transmission, you need ventilation. All this confusion and misinformation about the transmission routes reminds me of the old Indian folk story about the 6 blind people and the elephant. They all touch a part of it, and they're blindfolded, or they can't see the whole picture, and they have all different theories about what's going on. Every one of them is a little bit right, but taken together, they're all wrong. The Public Health Agency of Canada came out in October with this statement, and it basically said that after denying that it was airborne, that the infection can spread through respiratory droplets and aerosols. They also mentioned that these aerosols can linger in the air under some circumstances. Again, the 3 C's, crowded spaces, and that poor ventilation will aggravate this. And here you have the 3 C's mentioned. And one of the solutions is, again, ventilation, drawing as much fresh air from outside as possible. I think this is one of the best pictures I've seen that explain what's happening when you're talking, coughing, sneezing, that type of thing. The green particles are the droplets. They're the large particles that come out of your mouth, nose, and you can see that they fly like projectiles. They go up and then they fall down to the floor. Now the red stuff is a cloud that comes with it. These are the small particles, and they come out in a puff, a kind of a jet stream that slows down and eventually gets picked up by the air currents, and they stay airborne. And these two happen together. It's not like the red doesn't exist and it's only the green particles. They come out together. And these are the various pathways that people have come up with of how the infection can transfer from an infected person to a person at risk of infection. And the writing is very small, so I've expanded it. So we start with an infected person, and they have some type of respiratory activity, which means breathing, talking, coughing, sneezing. And you end up with large droplets and secretions. And these secretions can end up in someone else's eyes, nose, or mouth. They can also end up on the hands of a person who is susceptible, and they can touch their own eye, nose, and mouth. They can also end up on surface contamination via the hands of a person who is infected or just dropping. And one person can also touch another person and pass on. And once a person has virus, even though they're not infected, they can pass that contamination onto a surface, which again can go onto another person. Then we have the smaller particles, aerosols or small droplets, and some of these can be inspired, which means it ends up in the top part of your respiratory system, not in the bottom. The very small particles can go all the way down to the bottom of the lungs. And all three of these routes can cause an infection in a person at risk. Not to mention that some of the aerosols and droplets can also stick to the ceiling or to other surfaces and cause surface contamination. We also have the issue of fecal and urinary transmission. Remember the bathrooms in Hong Kong and Korea? So how do we stop this? Well, we put a mask on the person who's infected, and hopefully that blocks these paths. We ask people who are dealing with people who are sick to wear masks, wash their hands, and goggles and gowns. We also suggest face masks on people who are susceptible. And hand washing to stop the contamination from surfaces to the hands, to the eyes, nose, or mouth. And face shields again for people who are infected but don't know it. Then we also have masks to stop the small aerosols and droplets. And these are the masks that are put on the person who is infected. However, a person who is receiving this needs an N95 to stop the small droplets and aerosols because they are not effectively stopped by the surgical masks. And of course, we also need to do surface cleaning wherever it's could be contaminated. So looking at that complete maze of transmission pathways, how does ventilation fit into all this? Well, first of all, you got to understand what the ventilation system is. You have air coming in from two sources, one being recirculated and one from the outside, and that gets mixed and it either gets heated or cooled. And then it goes through pipes and goes into rooms, and there's a return, the purple arrows, that goes back. Some of it gets exhausted, but some of it gets recycled. If you're in an office or a classroom, this is what the supply usually looks like and what the returns usually look like. The air comes out of the supply and goes back to the ventilation system through the return. So it's a good idea to actually go on the roof and look at these systems. If you're part of a health and safety committee, you should put this on your tour. Make sure you look inside too. Stop the power to it, open it up, and have a look. You'll never know what you'll find. Here you see a lot of water damage, dirt. You see a filter that's bent out of shape, so it's not sitting there. Plus the filters are fairly dirty. So put on your to-do list. Go look inside your HVAC unit. Measuring airflow. This is the way it's properly done. Those vents in the ceiling, you can put these little pup tent machines over top of it, and it measures the airflow. You can also use this machine, but it's a little more complicated. The problems with air changes per hour is that while most HVAC systems are designed to turn over the air 6 times per hour. This only happens if you leave the fan setting on, not on auto. It only comes on when you need heating or cooling, which is not all the time, and therefore it's off. And when it's off, there's no air coming in. Usually most HVAC systems only have about 10 to 25% of the air being recirculated by the HVAC unit is actually outdoor air. And thus, if you have 5 or 6 air turnovers per hour, but only 10 to 25% of that air is fresh air, then actually the outdoor exchange rate is actually 0.5 to 1.5 air changes per hour. And this all assumes you have perfect mixing, which means that the air circulates over the whole volume of the room and there are no dead air spaces, which there usually are. Open windows and doors will give you more air changes. If you go to 100% outdoor supply, you won't be able to manage the temperature and humidity in extreme weather conditions. So as we get very cold here in our winter, it's hard to take in 100% outdoor air. So another thing to put on your to-do list is to make sure the fan setting is on. So sometimes carbon dioxide is used as a surrogate for measuring outdoor air supply, and we know that the outdoor level of carbon dioxide is about 400 to 500 parts per million. And if you're below 600, it's usually not a problem. If you're between 600 and 800, it's a possible problem. 800 to 1,000, it's a probable problem. And if you're over 1,000, you need more outdoor air. And here's the color scheme we'll be using for these levels. This also relates to the ASHRAE standard, which basically recommends 900 parts per million for an office type environment. Here's a pattern which is fairly typical. At 8 o'clock in the morning, the carbon dioxide level is about 550 parts per million, and as people enter the building, it climbs and it reaches just before 12 o'clock, almost 900, and then has a little dip during lunchtime, goes back up, and in the middle of the afternoon, around 3 o'clock, it's at about 950 parts per million. And then you have people gradually leaving the office, and you see it, a curve going down from about 850 down to about 550 parts per million. And this is the typical view. Now this slope of this decay curve, we call it, from about 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening till about 5 o'clock in the morning, you can calculate the air changes per hour from that curve. And here's, we superimpose the categories that we talked about earlier in the. There's also the issue of thermal comfort. When you're trying to get as much outdoor air quality or outdoor air supply as possible, the problem is that people will not be thermally satisfied because at very cold and very warm temperatures, the system will not be able to control the temperature. Now in the spring and the fall, when the outdoor temperature is about 10 degrees or 50 degrees Fahrenheit, you can take as much outdoor air as you want because that's the temperature at which the HVAC tries to temper the air. However, under the extremes, you won't be able to keep that temperature. So you need to tell people that they need to start wearing sweaters, take blankets, thin gloves, space heaters, whatever they need, because the more outdoor air you supply, the harder it is to control the temperature. Open windows, the use of barriers could disrupt airflows. If you want to follow the pattern of the air, I would suggest buying one of those soap bubble guns and watch the bubbles and see which way the air flows. Relative humidity will also be very difficult to maintain in a Canadian winter. If you are looking at humidifying the air, it's recommended to use steam injection humidification systems. So another thing on the to-do list is to prepare the building occupants for thermal discomfort. So here we see ranges of relative humidity and the ranges at which various problems in buildings occur. And you can see the optimum range is probably between 30 and 60% relative humidity for most of these. However, for viruses, you want it even a little higher, about 45 to 70% relative humidity. And as I said already, that's hard to do in Canadian winter. Here's a pattern of measurement of carbon dioxide, which is the blue bar, and then you see in gray the relative humidity, and it's pretty obvious that the relative humidity is following the carbon dioxide exactly. And this happens when the source of moisture in the air is exhaled breath, and the carbon dioxide is a measure of exhaled breath, and when it patterns this way with the relative humidity, it means that your moisture is coming from people's breathing, and that's not how you want to humidify a workplace. Here again, I've put the colors on top, and you can see that the carbon dioxide is pretty good, but the relative humidity is well below the 45 to 70%. So another thing on your to-do list is to check into humidification. Here are some standards being recommended for the pandemic on how to adjust your ventilation system. And these come from the US, ASHRAE, from the European Union, RIVA, and also from Japan and China. Now this is a little bit hard to read, but we have a ventilation checklist that's available on the OCAL website that you can download that will take you through some of these items. So another thing for your to-do list is to download this checklist and review it. Now here I've reworked the table you saw on the previous slide, and I've expanded the font so you can read it better. But it's interesting to note, first of all, outdoor air, everybody agrees, take in as much as possible. Hours of operation, there's a bit of difference. Some people say run it 24/7. Others say, well, at least 2 hours before occupancy and 2 hours after. Temperature, humidity settings, it depends. Again, demand controlled ventilation. What this is when you measure carbon dioxide, and then after it reaches a certain level, you kick in extra outdoor air. So when they say use the CO2 set point of 400 parts per million, this is background level, so it will always be on. And in Japan, they also say set the CO2 level lower, but in ASHRAE, they say disable it. Filters, this is really interesting because the ASHRAE, the US, recommends increasing filtering. However, for the other society, they say filter as usual, or replace them more often, or maintain them as usual. So we'll talk about this a little bit more. But so far we have no cases from contact tracing of people being infected by people in another room via the ventilation system. So it's unclear whether this extra filtering is really necessary. Whether the new variant and its increased transmissibility will change that, we don't know yet. ASHRAE doesn't really talk about ventilating washrooms, but it's implied if you're running it 24/7. But the other societies make a point of telling you to run the ventilation for the washrooms 24/7. And a couple of them also make a point of closing the lid when you're flushing. Remember that diagram I showed with all the particles being expelled from the open toilet? Also to avoid water seals drying out. And that goes back to some of the problems that we saw with the apartment buildings in China and South Korea. So here's another thing to do on the to-do list is to take this table and compare it with the checklist and give it to the Joint Health and Safety Committee and see what they can do. Sometimes you can't do filters, so you have to look at other things. So you need to mix and match to see what you can do to optimize your situation in your building. Regarding filters, Jeffrey Siegel of the U of T, who's an indoor air quality expert, looked at these, and he basically says in most situations, filters may be considerably less effective than other infection control measures, including social distancing, isolation of known cases, and hand washing. So don't put your eggs in all one basket. If your system can't handle these higher efficiency filters, don't worry about it. There's other things you can do. There is also another issue which suggests that the virus hitches a ride with the particles that are already in the air, and thus it can penetrate the lungs with a greater efficiency. So removing the particulate with better filtering might also have a benefit if the virus is hitchhiking on those particles. Now, a while ago, the government said they were going to give $50 million to upgrade school HVAC systems, and if you do the calculations, it ends up about $10,000 per school. So what do you do with $10,000 per school with an HVAC? So that amount of money is just about enough to buy a bunch of air purifiers. So that's what people are doing. One thing to look at when you're looking to buy an air purifier is the Clean Air Delivery Rate, or CADR. And you roughly need, for every 100 square foot, 70 CFM. So for the first one in the blue, you see 312 CFM, which is roughly about 450 square feet. 400 CFM is about 600 square feet, and 560 CFM will cover about 800 square feet. So you need to size them properly. Another thing to take account of is the maximum noise level. In most offices and classrooms, it's recommended that the background noise level not exceed 30 to 40 decibels. And here we see that the levels of noise are 50, 56, and 70 decibels, which is much higher. Jeffrey Siegel again on UV systems, which are another thing that was being touted as a solution. Again, these are complex systems, and unless you know what you're doing, you should probably not get involved in them. Plus, there are some dangers. Some of the other technologies too, like ionizers, ozone generators, etc., all have some serious toxic issues which need to be addressed and are probably not a solution if you're not tech savvy about these things. So they
John, I'm not sure
suggest
what happened, but the
that
sound just went.
the removal of and control of COVID sources is the number one. Okay. Do you want me to continue verbally?
I was still hearing sound. It's Beth here.
Oh,
Yeah, I was still getting sound on my end. Let me just see.
okay, then maybe it
we
was
have,
just me disregard. I really apologize.
yeah.
Thing to do. Keep people who have COVID or are associated with exposure to COVID from going into the indoor space. Engineering controls like HVAC units can work if they're done properly, and you can also look at opening windows and doors. Then there's administrative controls by reducing the number of people in the indoor space, and then obviously the protection that individuals can do by keeping their distance, practicing good respiratory etiquette, and wearing a face mask. And this is all part of the hierarchy of controls where you try to stop it at the source, prevent people who are sick from coming into the building, along the path using the ventilation system, and at the worker using the personal protective behaviors. And it all comes down to communicating, cleaning, hand washing, ventilating, distancing, screening, and masking. And there are lots of resources online, like this poster for schools that discuss these things, and it'd be a good idea to add to your to-do list to use some of these creative communication tools and apply them to your workplace. So here is your to-do list, and I won't go over these, but remember that working on the ventilation system isn't the only thing you do. It's also communicating, cleaning, hand washing, distancing, screening, and masking. They're all parts of the puzzle, and just by getting too focused on one of the things, you might ignore something else, which may actually be more effective than, let's say, arguing about how good the filter should be. What about the new variants? Well, first of all, they cause increased transmissibility. These will make all these controls all the more important. In EU, for instance, in Bavaria, people are being asked to wear N95s on public transport and in shops. Here's a news item, and it was being enforced as of January 18th. So thanks for your time and attention, and in the words of famous Canadian musician Bruce Cockburn, open up the window and let the bad air out.
Thank you so much, John. We had one question very early on, but I think it's probably been answered. So the question was, are employers obligated to provide data for fresh air returns with recirculated air? And I think you did answer that, but maybe you can.
Okay. Yeah, if you're in the federal jurisdiction, there is a clause in the buildings part of the, I'm not sure exactly which it is, but it's the, it contains a section on the HVAC unit, I think it's called, and indoor air quality. And so unlike other jurisdictions, which like in my province here in Ontario, where we don't have indoor air quality legislation, federal workplaces do have it, and therefore the ASHRAE standard is referenced. And so, yes, you do have an avenue to, in the regulations, to enforce the meeting of ASHRAE standards. That being said, ASHRAE has different standards for the pandemic than for the usual, but what I personally find in most workplaces, it's hard enough getting the regular standards to get adopted and implemented, let alone the pandemic standards.
Thank you, John. If I can just follow up a little bit on that. You need to address this with your health and safety committee. I do know that these issues are very, very complicated issues to understand in terms of the airflow and the air return and, you know, the ventilating system on top of the roof of the building. But you must continue to pressure the employer to get that information because they are obligated to give it to you. And especially now, they're obligated not to keep you in the dark with about information as it relates to people's health. You know, that's their obligation under the Act. Okay, I don't see any other hands up or any other questions here for us.
Angela, can I jump in?
Sure.
So I do actually see a couple questions for John in the Q&A box. One is, will Merv 13 filters catch the virus? And would these filters be contaminated? And should they be treated as hazmat?
The short answer is yes. That's their purpose, is to catch small particles. And viruses are not free-floating in the air. So when you look up in a diagram and you find out, or online, and you find out the virus is 0.13 microns in size, they're not floating there by themselves. They're floating in a mixture of whatever your secretions are from your lungs and from your upper respiratory system. So they're in these mixtures, and they're a little larger than just the virus by itself. And these filters are designed to capture. The higher the filter number, I think if you go to 17 or 18, that's equivalent to a high efficiency particulate filter or HEPA filter, the more you capture. And if you're capturing them, yes, they should be handled as contaminated. That being said, there's been very few cases of people being infected via contact, surface contact. At the beginning of the pandemic, people were saying, wash your hands, you can get it off surfaces. But using contact tracing, we've found very, very few cases of people who have actually been infected solely by touching a surface and then infecting themselves. So yes, I would, if I was changing the filters, I would use precautions, gloves, things like that, washing hands, not banging them into my face, etc. But again, we haven't seen too many people being infected between rooms. So I'm not sure that this is as important as some of the other things.
Thanks for that. There's also another question. If the workplace washrooms have limited ventilation and no lids on the toilets, what would you advise? Do you advise putting urinals out of order as well?
It's if a person has the infection, and sometimes they can find viral RNA in the urine, but they're very confident that that viral RNA is not contagious. It's not viable. The toilet seat is another issue, and if I was on a health and safety committee, I would pull out some of the standards I was showing, not the ASHRAE one, obviously, because it doesn't address it, but the one from the EU especially would be good. And saying, people are saying, close your toilet seat. If you want some ammunition to back that up, go to the slides where I show how in Korea and Japan, or Korea and Hong Kong, it goes from one bathroom to the next. Although given our architecture, it's unlikely that that type of thing would happen, but it does show that it can get into the air. And so if you put a lid on it, obviously it's better than if the lid's up.
Thanks, John. There's also a question. Do you think coughing or sneezing into the bend of your elbow is effective?
Well, that opens the can of worms. If you're around people, you should be wearing a mask. And I don't know if you've tried to sneeze into a mask. It's not a pretty experience. And you probably want to change your mask. So if you don't have a mask on, coughing or sneezing into your elbow is one way to reduce the number of particles that get into the air. It's not a very good way. It's not the best. It's probably better than nothing. It's all a matter of degrees. Right now, in certain places in Europe, they're saying wear an N95. I hate to sneeze inside an N95. So yes, it's complicated. I know one time I was driving, and I drive a standard. And so I was turning a corner while shifting gears and then sneezing at the same time. I don't know if you've ever experienced that, but it gets very difficult. Yeah, it's better than nothing, but it's not the best way. And then, if you're giving somebody, a hug around the neck or with that elbow, I'm not sure if that's the best way either.
Hmm. The next question is, should members using public transit to travel to work be encouraged to use N95 masks, and should the employer be providing them while they're frontline workers?
That's an interesting question, because a few months ago, I do a lot with the healthcare unions, and the healthcare people are getting infected with COVID at a lot higher rates than the general public. However, the infection control people were quite satisfied that their protocols were sufficient. So they were saying, oh, the healthcare workers are getting infected on the subway. This was in Toronto. So we actually looked at TTC workers, and the TTC is doing a really outstanding job of being transparent about their infections. They have a website where there's a list of all the people who got infected. The names aren't there, but the job that they perform and the location they perform it in is all listed. And when we looked at, we divided the number of TTC workers by the number of people working for the TTC, but the number of people infected by the total number, and the percentage came out to the same as the percentage of people in Toronto that were being infected. Now, that was when the ridership was very low. The ridership has gone up, so I haven't checked that yet. So I'm not sure that public transit with any, as long as it has some type of face covering, I don't think is that dangerous. Without a face covering, it is, and there's been many documented cases of transmission. Now, there was one other thing I was going to say about that, and N95s. In Bavaria, which is a province in Germany, it is now mandatory to wear N95s on public transit and in retail stores. I think it's also mandatory in Austria. The rest of the German nation is also looking at adopting that. And I think there was an opinion piece in the Washington Post that's saying people in the general population should be wearing N95s. And this is all because of the variant. The variant has increased transmissibility. And so everything that we've learned about transmission up to about now may change. And we really don't know. Right now, there's an interesting pair of outbreaks, one in Australia and one in New Zealand, where they found people had transmission without close contact. So they're investigating whether the ventilation system could have been a source of transmission. However, they haven't concluded their investigations yet, so we don't really know. But I think the recommendation to wear N95s is basically using the precautionary principle. I know that since things have gotten really bad with the numbers around Christmas and afterwards, I personally have been using an N95 when I go out into stores and things like that. And you know, if you assume that the variant is more transmissible and it's transmissible through the air, then it makes sense if you want to protect yourself to use an N95. I don't see, I've been dealing a lot with Public Health Ontario and the Public Health Agency of Canada. We can't even get N95s for healthcare workers, let alone the general public. So I don't think any of the government agencies will be recommending that the general public be wearing N95s unless things get extremely bad, which is what Europe is a few months ahead of us. So my suspicion is that we could have problems with the variants at the end of March, early April, is when some of the projections suggest that things could heat up again.
Thanks, John. There's a couple questions I just want to combine around masks while we're on that topic, and then there is another question about office cleaning. So one person has written, masks with vents are not recommended. Why is that? And then another person has said they've started double masking. A lot of info has come out recently. I assume that they're indicating that this is a way to support you if you can't get access to an N95 mask. Any comments on that, John?
Sure. Actually, the two of them could be a little bit related. The N95s with the valves, there are two studies that have been done, and both have shown that the valve actually does no worse than a surgical mask. It does let more out than an N95 without a valve, but it's no worse than a surgical mask, and the surgical mask is what all the authorities are recommending. However, because there are only two studies and people haven't studied it with the COVID virus, they want to be extra careful. And so they're saying, don't use it. 3M just came out with a publication where they did some testing, and they said if you use 3M tape and tape up the inside of the 3M respirator valve, that will work. So they're covering their legal things. I think probably any duct tape will work, but they're saying only with 3M duct tape. But doubling the mask, yes, I used to work in a foundry years ago, and when I came there, they weren't using N95s, so people were using surgical masks, and they were doubling, tripling, and whatever, because what they were finding is they were getting black dust in their nose wearing just a single surgical mask. We soon fixed that and gave them all N95s. N95s should be fit tested. They're a respirator, and there are standards for using respirators. And if the general public start using N95s, the one thing I'm worried about is that the healthcare workers will be able to have a good enough supply of them. But if you're not fit testing them, and you're not, following the rules of not infecting yourself, then the way you don and doff them, there are some people suggesting that the use of an N95 could actually increase contact transmission. And so there are people saying we shouldn't advise people to use N95s if they don't know how to use them or haven't been adequately trained. So it's not a black and white thing. I've worn respirators for about 40 years and worked in places where you had to wear. I worked in a pesticide factory at one time, and I was top to toe with PPE, including taping my sleeves to my gloves. So if you're familiar with them, fine. But if you're not familiar with them, go watch some videos on how to properly put them on and take them off.
Awesome. Thanks, John. So I'm just looking at the time. I'll ask one more question, John, and then we'll turn it over to Angela to wrap up. So they said, hi, curious as to how long after an infected person worked 8 hours in an office would there be traces of live virus? Also, if awareness happens 7 to 8 days later, should there still be a cleaning disinfection done in that office, or is it too late to matter at that point?
Okay, there are two issues with going into a room where a person who has been infected was. First of all, as I said, most air systems can have 5 to 6 air changes per hour if you're running the fan constantly. And so you actually turn over the air in a room within an hour or two of somebody leaving. So about 99% of the particles would be gone in about 2 hours. So that's the air particles. Now, the air particles that were in the room and settled on the floor, or any sneezing or coughing, etc., that put fomites on surfaces, they can be cleaned. Now, it's easy to clean this virus. It doesn't last long outside of the body. So soap and water and elbow grease and a good cloth will probably, remove the virus. Also on surfaces, it lasts longer on some surfaces than others. And ironically, one of the surfaces it lasts the longest on is N95 respirators. But it won't last days. It will probably last hours. And if you have a regular cleaning, which you should be doing anyway, it will probably be mostly gone anyway after a good cleaning. And you don't probably need to use a lot of dangerous chemicals. You don't need to fog the area with dangerous chemicals in order to kill the virus. It should be readily cleanable. It doesn't survive that long outside the body. It needs a body to replicate, and the conditions in a body and the outside conditions are not good. Now, the only case that I've seen where people have had transmission through contact were food workers working in frozen foods. And this happened in Beijing in China. They had some food from Europe that had COVID contamination on it, and people got infected. But these people were handling frozen food as their job continuously. So I wouldn't worry about it in a grocery store. But it can happen. It's been very rare. I wouldn't lose sleep over it if you got a good cleaning protocol.
Awesome. Thanks, Angela. You want to jump in?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, John, for bringing that very informative presentation to us about the airborne risks and ventilation and people returning back to work. John, you said that your presentation would be available. A number of people have asked for that. So we will, if we be sending that out to people. I think it's also going to be posted on the website. Just the evaluation form will be emailed to you after this session, and get that back to us, and we appreciate that. We look forward to hearing your feedback in order to ensure that we are bringing information to you that is helpful. So that's it for me. I don't know if Beth or Nicole want to say anything in closing.
Angela,
no,
if I
nothing
can.
here. Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Go ahead, John.
Yeah, I just posted in there's a longer version of what I presented here.
Okay.
And it's available on our website, and I put the link into the chat box. I hope people can see it.
Yes, thank you, John. And I do want to just tell everybody that PSAC and I always link into OCAL because they have some wonderful resource people there. They have some great information. So if you're looking for any more information around this stuff, or your health and safety committees need some assistance in explaining something, I'm sure you can go to OCAL. They're really wonderful, informative people with a lot of knowledge. So thank you for sharing your evening and your presentation with us here tonight, John. And thank you, everybody else, all the other presenters from Ottawa, and to my two co-facilitators and my helper. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great night. Bye, everybody. Signing off.